Welcome to Shaping the New York City Skyline, a podcast that explores the stories behind the buildings that shape our city. With your hosts, David Shamshovich, Brenda Slokowski, and Camilla Almeida.
Hey guys, welcome back.
We're here in our amazing studio, which Brenda and Camilla have put together with their style so well. And season 3 is underway. You guys have had a couple of great episodes, and listen, more to come. And today we had Eric Enderlin from HDC, which is a really amazing get. And we're very excited to talk to him, to sit down.
Amazing.
You guys, he, first of all, has so much knowledge and says it in such an eloquent way that I really feel like I got to know his mental process and how he thinks about things. It's so clear to see his perspective as he transitions through different areas of his life. And I like seeing his passion for New York City. Like it comes through so evidently. It's very interesting to see. I like it.
Exactly.
Yeah. And his urban policy background, economic background, which, put him in a position to do land use and zoning and planning. And he really understands the ins and outs of creation of affordable housing and the costs behind it. And one of the things that I found very poignant, which is closer to the end of the episode, is his perspective about the gripe about tax exemptions and people saying it's a giveaway. And certainly that's one perspective, not one we particularly share, and not one that he shares or most of the government agencies share. And the perspective that he gave is you can't just look at what the cost of something is, meaning the cost of that tax exemption to the city or to the people of the city, because you're losing that tax revenue. You have to look at what the cost is of not providing that affordable housing or that mixed income in a mixed income building. And that's an interesting perspective, because if you're not doing something, there's a cost to that too, right? If you build that building, you're creating an opportunity for affordable housing where it couldn't have been created otherwise. You're giving opportunities to people who wouldn't have had it otherwise, putting them in an area that they couldn't potentially have lived otherwise, and then potentially changing a neighborhood because things tend to follow when you create residential housing. And so it's an important perspective. And I think that, to me, that was the main takeaway. And the main thing that really was so impressive to me that I'm not sure I necessarily thought about the cost of not doing it. And I really want to stress that to everybody that's listening, anybody that has a different perspective, that there is that cost, and that has to be put into the analysis.
Definitely. It's your foregone cost, right?
You would-
There's some sort of economic concept
It's
that
not
quantifies that.
It's not what
think
you're
you're right.
losing when you're getting the tax incentives. It's what you're losing when you're not getting it.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's a perspective that I think is just one of the many things that he discussed, including his career, his trajectory from NYCHA to HPD to the head of HDC, being appointed by the prior Mayor de Blasio and the current reappointed by Mayor Adams. And he has the practical experience, he has the policy understanding, the economic background, and he shared a slew of interesting information from things like funding affordable housing in connection with low-income housing tax credits, or the PAC program, or RAD under the federal government, and just his understanding and how he moved through government, and the great people that are currently at the helm of the various agencies, who I refer to as rock stars. We have some pretty impressive people who've done some heavy lifting from the city of Yes, which is just a monumental accomplishment, to creating a new tax exemption, and New York City, which has been stagnant for 2.5-3 years or so, waiting for new programs, waiting for zoning to change so building can happen, is poised to undergo a significant change.
Yeah. And if anybody has questions about the city of Yes or the UAP, the changes to MIH, anything 485X condo, feel free to contact our office, because we're here for you.
Yeah. You know, one thing that I thought it was interesting, we're always talking about housing and we need more housing, but he brought attention to education, the transit, the Metro North, everything. That people forget those items also have to be taken into account.
Yeah, the assets around the housing that
Exactly.
have to happen.
Yeah, it's a package of goods, right? Housing doesn't live in a vacuum because housing means education,
Groceries.
exactly. You want to have fresh foods, you want to have transportation, you want to have opportunity, and housing is part of that. And planning is part of that. Urban planning, land use, all that stuff. A lot of thinking goes into it. A lot of thinking went into the city of Yes. And like Brenda said, please feel free to reach out to us or listen to our earlier episodes from last season.
We are the UAP rock stars.
The UAP rock stars, along with myself, Alvin, of course. And, those episodes are great. Listen to our 485X episode. And we fully intend on bringing more information. So listen up as...
Stay tuned.
Yeah.
You never know what's going to come your way.
Well, UAP's evolving. It's brand new. And I don't know how many things will be up in the air by the time that this episode airs. But I know that there's going to be some time for people to get acclimated and to understand it. And we obviously know this program very well because it's a offshoot of voluntary inclusionary housing. And Eric also talks about UAP and how important it is to provide just a little bit of housing or more housing, affordable housing throughout the city, citywide, and how that works with the tax exemption. You can listen to our prior episodes that discuss that, or you can listen to this episode to understand kind of the policies and Eric's deep understanding of the economics.
Deep understanding.
Yeah, and urban planning and policy and all these things that he discusses and how these things all work together. This episode is phenomenal. I can't thank you so much, Eric.
Yeah. Thank you, Eric. It was
for-
great.
And our Skyliners are going to love it.
That's right.
Yep.
So without further ado, Eric Enderlin from HDC.
Ooh.
We're truly honored to welcome Eric Enderlin, a visionary leader and driving force behind New York City's affordable housing initiatives. As president of the New York City Housing Development Corporation since 2016 and reappointed by Mayor Adams in 2022, Eric has spearheaded transformative efforts in financing and developing affordable housing across the city. His leadership has been instrumental in achieving record-breaking housing production and preserving landmark affordable housing communities like Stuyvesant Town and Riverton Houses. With over 2 decades of experience in public policy and urban planning, Eric's impact extends beyond his executive role. As an adjunct faculty member at esteemed institutions such as the New School and NYU, he has mentored the next generation of real estate finance and development professionals. Eric's dedication to housing affordability has not only provided homes to countless New Yorkers, but has also reshaped the city's housing landscape for the better, or as Brenda would say, shaping the NYC skyline. In recognition of his remarkable contributions, he was awarded the prestigious Public Service Award in 2024. Eric, it's an absolute honor to have you here today, and a warm welcome.
Thank you. Good morning. It's great to be here with you all.
Yeah, and we're super excited to have you here. I like to start at the beginning, and it's kind of like a therapy session. Did you grow up in New Jersey?
I did mostly in New Jersey. My dad was a chemist at Roman Haas, I think, there. But mostly in New Jersey. A little bit of Florida, a little bit of Oregon, but yeah.
So you were doing a lot of, is it because of your father's job? Was it...
That was part of it early on, but more, it's a New Jersey family. I can't deny that. A lot of my family came to New York early on my dad's side was in the Lower East Side in the 1850s, but then quickly out to New Jersey. And my mother's side, at least a portion of it goes back even further. A Dutch family in Brooklyn in like the late 1600s also came down. A lot of people don't realize this, but Brooklyn would just hop over from Breezy Point to Sandy Hook and then come down the Monmouth County coast and into the coastal area. So that's kind of my family history.
Wow.
So
You're
a lot of
New York.
yeah, you can't. After a couple of generations in the graveyard, you can't deny your home state. So I would have to claim New Jersey.
Fair enough.
I don't know. It feels like you're really a New Yorker.
New York.
So I had a great uncle who was in the last council of Brooklyn. He was a council member when Brooklyn was an independent city before unification of the city, and then his brother was a freeholder in Atlantic County, New Jersey, and part of that Atlantic County machine that included Nookie Johnson and all that. So a lot of a lot of New York, New Jersey in that, and fairly political in a way that future generations learn to stay away from politics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So your dad was a chemist. What kind of work did your mother do?
Her father was in the lumber business in New Jersey, and she ended up working in building and development, a lot of single-family houses, but she had a lot of thoughts and vision for places like Camden, New Jersey. She was kind of an urbanist before that was even really a thing. When I reflect on it now, I've actually had time to think back on that, and she was kind of visionary in that way before a lot of other people were thinking about it. So she had a lot of thoughts about, I think her dream was always to rehabilitate an old firehouse in a city like Camden or something like that, to do an adaptive reuse of something like that, just at a personal level. But beyond that, I think she was really into the idea of urban renewal.
Is that where your like drive, is that where you were first exposed to like the real estate of it all?
Probably, but I never thought of it that way.
Okay.
I in retrospect, I do think of it that way, but I do recognize a certain pragmatism in my family. The fact that there's an academic edge to them, but they also stayed on a very practical, pragmatic side, whether it's some politics, whether it's chemistry on my dad's side. My brother's a doctor, and my mother obviously stayed on the construction side of things and had the comments that I just made. So it's a fairly, there's some idealism in there, and there's some theory and philosophy of things, but there's also a lot of practice that went into when I think about my immediate family. But I am also the only one who stayed in a larger structure of government, like not without just, the politicians of generations ago. I'm the only one who's worked in kind of a bureaucracy, which has its own challenges.
For a very long time as well. So obviously you made it to Rutgers, you got an economics degree. Was the plan to then do something further with it, or did you have other ideas when you were in college?
I think most people who had an economics degree, and I also had an English and a minor in German, but the plan was that you thought you were going to do something on Wall Street. You imagined that. And I remember going to an interview right out of college, and I was sitting next to a kid who was kind of in my same situation, and he was working. And basically what he described to me, he was very pleased with the work he had, but he was essentially describing predatory lending. And he was telling me how where he was now, he had this great situation because they were lending into home ownership. And it was great because you either got paid, and it was good pay, or you got the collateral. And he was kind of like proud of that. And it struck me. I was like, that's not exactly where I think I want to.
You saw the face of evil right there. Right?
You see this later too sometimes in your career. You see folks, younger people sometimes, who get themselves in trouble because they don't know, and sometimes they're guided by people who say, this is the way it is, this is the way it works, this is what, I know it doesn't seem right, but this is the way things can be. And I think you got to guard against that. But also, I think one thing about mentoring younger people is to help them understand where that kind of conflict can exist, and to really think through, because I think there are younger folks who are ambitious and just want to do something and don't really understand the full import of what they might be engaging.
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with that. This is one of the reasons why this podcast exists, is to give different perspectives. I think that's an interesting point, because it sounds like it was very poignant. It was a moment in time where you're really thinking about it. But was that one of the moments where you started thinking about shifting your perspective from what people think as the evils of Wall Street, money, things like that, to something different?
Yeah, and I wouldn't frame it that way. My whole career has been ways in which you can shape really powerful influences to do good things with. You just have to be thoughtful about it and the way you direct those kinds of forces. What I do think, though, I thought about this more lately, where people are like, this red state, blue state thing, and people are like, I could never live in Florida, I could never do this, I could never do that. When I was in my 20s, you lived in communities where you thought about the community at the town level or the community level or the neighborhood level, and you didn't really rise it up to this level of like red state, blue state, I would never live here, I could never live there, and that it wasn't that polarized at the time. It was political in the sense that many of us recognized the need to live and operate in communities and support the people around us, have them support us, support businesses that you cared about and you felt were in connection with a sense of community as well. But it wasn't as polarized. So and that's, I think, where my impetus towards urban planning took on a more mature form. It wasn't just like, something that was an impulse in my family or things that my mother had done or my grandfather might have been in a lumber business, and therefore I had that kind of a thought process. I think it came more out of a community planning approach and a neighborhood planning approach. And I think that's what motivated me. Being a gay man, you realized in the 80s and in the 90s that there were certain organizing that was important to do. Fair housing is not just an issue that is defined by race. It's oftentimes an issue that can be thought of from a variety of minoritized perspectives. So, housing is often gendered in ways, orientation be an issue. I remember a lot of times there were young folks who were like, you didn't know what the politics of your landlord were, right? You didn't know what that kind of community situation was. You didn't know what the politics of your neighborhood were necessarily going to be. So people kind of picked and chose places where you could build and connect that kind of community and understand what kind of environment you were operating in.
Yeah, I think that's a really great perspective that you just pointed out, and I think that's 100% correct. You stayed in Rutgers, and you went and you got a degree in urban planning. What was the plan in getting that degree? Was there a long-term strategy in that?
I think when I think about it, I actually owned a business with a partner in Highland Park right across from New Brunswick, and it was a bagel shop. I owned a bagel dish in Highland Park for almost a decade. And that was the kind of place that was very much what I just talked about, the sense of, you had a film co-op advertising through there, and we would support the film co-op, and there were a lot of arts and stuff. There was very academic graduate students who worked there. You had this sense of neighborhood. There were a lot of faculty from the university who lived in Highland Park. And so you had that sense of it. And at the same time, I started looking at some of the redevelopment that was happening in New Brunswick, and I started thinking about the housing issues that I just described to you, and, ended up living in a multifamily house and doing some acquisition and rehab of small multifamily buildings in New Brunswick. And I think that was the first impulse. You began to see how those things operated together, how redevelopment of an area might move through a corridor, how at the time Rutgers was connecting Rutgers College with Douglas College, which was the historic women's college that's affiliated with Rutgers. And you could see those connections happening, and you could see how housing and neighborhood development played a role in that. There's a big rise of like GIS, and mapping was, technologically on the rise then. Huge amounts of people used to talk about like the monies in transportation planning. That was a big, area. And for me, though, I felt much more connected to housing, neighborhood, and community development. And so I think that motivated me in that direction. And in fact, when I was at Rutgers in graduate school, there's a professor there who's still there, David Listikin, who was ultimately my advisor on my master's thesis. And he's known as a houser, right? Fundamentally, that's he did a lot of the fair share stuff in New Jersey. And then after that, I did a lot of zoning and planning work for localities. I was the zoning officer in Metuchen. I worked for a firm in Princeton, community planning and research. We did the housing element and fair share plan for Metuchen. We did a transit area. They had these transit villages and transit towns, that kind of state planning that happened. And then I went and did affordable housing planning, land use planning, mediation, and Mount Laurel planning for the Council on Affordable Housing in New Jersey, which is basically the entity that at the time implemented the fair share plan.
Yeah.
Can you go into a little bit more detail about that fair share plan and how it came about and what your role in it was?
The whole set of Mount Laurel decisions in New Jersey that essentially affirmed the idea that towns have an obligation to provide and plan for their affordable housing needs. And so with that came a formula that determined how you figure out how much you need, how much you have, how much you need, what forms it can be in. And then in order to, there's something they called a builder's remedy, that if a town didn't affirmatively plan for their obligation, their need, and they didn't put it in a housing element of their master plan. I think in New Jersey they call it a master plan. Other places call it comprehensive planning. But the way you actually manage that was to affirmatively plan for it, develop a housing element in your master plan, And that gave you some protection because you then were actually saying, this is how we're going to meet the need. A developer could look at that and say, that's what we're going to do. And we'll come in, and maybe it got absorbed quickly, maybe it didn't, but it was planned for and it could happen. And the market ultimately would adjust to that and build it. Towns that didn't do it were at risk of being sued and having a builder's remedy be imposed upon it, where the builder could say, I can meet this obligation, I can do it right here. And so you kind of you gave up that level of control if you hadn't done the planning. And then connected to that, as you can imagine, as towns are trying to figure out where and how they might locate their affordable housing or how they might identify what they have already, that's a pretty intensive planning process that sometimes involves a lot of land use mediation and negotiation to figure out what's in and what's out and how that got managed at the time. It's different now. Politically, the obligation has shifted between different entities and how it gets implemented. But fundamentally, I would argue it's been successful. If you look at the region and you look at what states and what places have developed housing more broadly and more affordable housing, New Jersey is actually in a pretty good light from that analysis. New Jersey has added more housing to the region than anywhere else. If you look at New York State or Connecticut.
Did implementation of that plan involve a lot of zoning changes?
It did. You developed model ordinances that you could share with municipalities and they could use in order to kind of figure out how they were going to plan for it and put it out there. And they did. Ultimately, the way you did it was you went in and the towns went in and modified through their planning boards and then their councils the zoning for that town, because zoning is what implements the master plan ultimately. Right. So you would actually go in and you would modify your zoning to allow for the provision of affordable housing in some share.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
So you fixed New Jersey, right? So then you wanted to go to New York.
Well, it's just when you talk to people about urban planning in New York, like particularly people who don't think about it, they're like, what's there to plan? It's built. I don't think people realize how organic and renewing it is. And also, we are talking about building 50,000 units of new construction a year as the number that's required to meet the need. That's almost like that same kind of analysis of what do we actually need to meet it? And then when you realize that, I've been working on housing plans over various administrations, and the target number has gone up from, say, 15,000 a year to 20 to 25 to 30, now 50 as this moonshot goal. What you begin to realize is this is a constant need, that you lose housing and you need to replace it, and things change and you need to build new and you also need to preserve what you have. So it's this constant kind of renewing cycle of stuff that is never really finished.
Yeah.
And it's never really finished at scale. It's not just it's not finished at the edges. It's not finished in a really profound way, because ideally in a city, you've got this constant influx of new energy, new ideas, new people, new policies, and that's where some of the planning stuff, shapes the urban form.
Yeah.
We're shaping the NYC Skyline. That's right.
It's such an ever-evolving borough or town. All five of us.
Yeah.
But you can't there's no such thing as being stagnant in New York City. Everything is always changing. As of 2 days ago, we now have congestion pricing, and there's no scaffolding outside my building after I came back from vacation. So that's a whole new change for me.
I see, and I like that I think that kind of stuff is incredibly meaningful. I sometimes say that New York becoming more New York is actually a key thing. New York leaning into its New Yorkness, which I think congestion planning does. Yeah. I think the thoughtful and smart pivot from offices to residential is another moment in which New York becomes more New York. I think thinking about really pragmatic things like getting that scaffolding down, we've all lived with it. We've all had our favorite example of things we've hated about it. Yeah. I think figuring out the trash thing, moving trash to the gutter and off the sidewalk, and moving cafes from the gutter properly to the sidewalk at times, those kinds of really practical but thoughtful things. And then congestion pricing is it has the potential to be a really amazing thing when you let it play out over time. And I also think that New York has it can capitalize on the fact that it's not replicable. It's the greatest city in North America. and you really can't replace it. Like this idea that people are going to move to Miami and it's just, okay, there might be some wealth that moves to Miami, but you're not going to have this really powerful, really organic, really people-driven, neighborhood-driven experience that is New York.
Yeah.
It's not going to be easy. There are real risks to it, ultimately, to the city. But I think it's doing one of the best jobs that I can imagine. When you think about City of Yes, when you think about congestion pricing, when you think about what the state did in its last legislative session, I think people viewed the year before as dismal and kind of worrisome. And then the state pivoted and did some really great stuff. Yeah. And I think all those things are starting to work together in ways that will be impressive over time. And I think New York is moving in a good direction faster than a lot of other places. As you can tell, I'm pretty bullish on New York, but I think it's because of the people and the ideas and the fundamentals that I think it's hard to bet against New York.
Yeah.
I like how you phrased it, like New York leaning into its New Yorkness.
Yeah.
I think it's real,
Yeah.
right? I think it's like,
It's very true.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And not trying to like become something other. The other thing that I think is important about New York is that it's a global city. It's an organizing center. Some people call that an organizing center for capital, if you want to be cynical, which it is, though. But it's also just an organizing center. If you think about London, you think about Tokyo, you think about Hong Kong, you think about New York. Those kinds of global cities and organizing centers are really significant, but they also require really specific types of contact and communication. So face-to-face communication, this is the beauty of New York. I left my apartment 19 minutes before I got here, and then I'm here, right? And then I'm sitting across the room with you all, and you all could do the same thing. You could be in my office in 18 minutes if you needed to be, right?
Yeah.
So
Depends on where your office is.
With congestion pricing, maybe I'll be able to get it quicker.
Now that congestion pricing is in place, everybody's going to be on the subway. Nobody wants to pay that $9.
Well, more people will be, but ultimately it means that all the quality of our experience of that subway, you'll get to finish the 2nd Avenue subway, the gateway, which is in place but needs to be connected to everything else like Sunnyside and all the other pieces of improvement that can happen. And then for any of us who also travel this like remarkable radial system that comes out of New York City, unlike anywhere else, every suburban area that you go to, when I go down to the New Jersey shore, if I go down to Asbury Park, for example, most trains still require me, for no good reason, to transfer in Long Branch because they're electric tracks down to Long Branch and then diesel down below that. And there's a certain set of them that have dual engines that can make the switch. So every once in a while in a rush hour, they'll offer a 1-seat ride into the city. But that's the kind of investment that you can get. There's no reason why there shouldn't be a 1-seat ride all the way down to Bay Head or Point Pleasant or whatever town, and the same thing in every direction, right? So it's not just the improvement of the quality of transit that's experienced in New York City and that quality of life, because we all take the subway. I actually love it, to be honest. When it's working, it's really an amazing thing. I know, and it's, honestly, I was thinking about this last night. I have taken the subway for 20 plus years, and I thought to myself, I've never, knock wood somewhere here, I've never, been stuck. I thought about that.
Wow.
I've like 20 some years. I've never been stuck.
Really?
Oh,
Never.
you're lucky.
In the 90s?
Never.
I got stuck so many times on the subway.
Yeah. But the other point I want to make is that all of that network is the path out to like the Jersey City and Hoboken and Newark and all that remarkable zone that can be the potential of that is phenomenal as well. Everything that goes north of the city, right? Everything that goes west of the city, everything that goes out to Long Island. That is a network and a history that like no other place can.
Yeah.
You just can't. Like even the rights of way that were preserved, like the ability to have that track in place or that corridor in place, the public ownership of that. Think of it as a public good in that sense. You just can't really replicate that.
No,
So-
it's an amazing thing. I think infrastructure is extremely important for people to be able to travel, move. I mean, and now people are telecommuting. People are living in 2 places, sometimes 3, depending on the situation, and it's a totally different world, and we have to keep up.
Well, layer the subway system and the improvements that are happening that way with the City of Yes and their new parking requirements. Things are getting, and congestion pricing, add that in, things are getting way more efficient because the city is making the effort to like overlay all of these different laws and different infrastructure ideas.
Yeah. I think they work well together. And that's, by the way, that's not by accident. There's a lot of
I didn't expect it to be.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes you get lucky, but I think there's a lot of folks who are thinking really carefully about what you need to do to have those things work together.
Yeah.
So you get this degree, right? And your trajectory is, you're doing a lot of things, right? You're doing, they're all kind of centered around planning, zoning, things like that after college. And eventually you make your way to NYCHA. How does that happen? What's that road like, and how did you get there, and why did you want to go there?
Yeah, this a woman named Susan Feinstein, who was a professor at Rutgers. I think she was the person who said to me, housing is an area that's kind of underserved or under invested in terms of where urban planners go. And it kind of matched up with what I was thinking about anyway in terms of community planning. And there was a moment when I actually thought about doing, English or literature or something like that. Like there was a component of me that thought about that. And I was like, I looked at it and I was like, this is way too much theory. It felt too academic for me.
You needed more of a practical side.
I needed more of the practice. And I didn't know how beholden to politics the practice was going to be. But, you can...
It's probably a good thing you didn't know
Yeah,
that, right?
exactly. But it's okay. So right out of school, I did a summer experience with Reese reports, which were like a lot of analysis and data stuff, just briefly.
Yeah.
I then went to COA. I went to the state. And that was a really interesting set of planning experiences, and you have different counties that you cover. And it wasn't just like the land use planning of it. I'd also done some of the zoning work for Metuchen in New Jersey. That's where I did a housing element, fair share plan, a rail station area plan, worked with a planning firm in Princeton, which had a contract with Metuchen to do a lot of that work. And when I was working as a planner in Metuchen, the COA planner who was assigned to Middlesex County and Metuchen actually kind of asked me my interest in working more centrally on that and doing more of the stuff. So that connection came out of that. So I went to Trenton and I did Mount Laurel stuff for a couple years. And then briefly I did consulting. I did, I think, I don't want to say anything negative about consulting because I know people who are incredibly good at it. You need the right fit to really, it's a certain set of skills. It's a unique personality type. They do a lot of different stuff, but I worked for Berger for a while. And then from there, actually, it was an interesting thing. There was a connection there. They did a lot of Port Authority work as part of their work, but they also had some connections to NYCHA and public housing. So I kind of migrated over through a set of relationships where someone had moved to NYCHA and was thinking about staffing up and hiring. And a lot of it was the original pipeline work. Some of the stuff that you see around development that's happening on some of the NYCHA campuses, that was some of the original work that we did. I had a crazy title when I started there. It was called Asset Management and Private Market Operations, which is a ridiculous title.
Sounds super fancy.
Yeah, and it was also like in an era when I think NYCHA, and I'm grateful and I hope that I've been part of this, NYCHA has pivoted away from the idea of any kind of privatizing of it. Basically, anything that happens is a recognition that NYCHA is this kind of profound land trust, really. It's a public trust. And so NYCHA now doesn't sell its land, it leases its land and keeps control of it to do development. But that was the place where the first kind of pipelines of development, we had looked at some big zoning studies on it, and we looked at how much unused floor area existed on the campuses. I got to understand really well like the planning and economics of how public housing works, how it works politically in the city, but also in terms of the city charter, kind of the plan and project process, and then what kind of a resource it really is, what kind of a tremendous, I mean, when you think about 400,000 to 600,000 New Yorkers live in public housing at any moment, it's this city like the size of whether you want to call it Atlanta or Boston, but it's on that scale, right?
Wow.
And so when you started at NYCHA, what were your tasks? What kind of things did you work on? And how did that change over time?
I actually worked on and closed, and then, closed meaning financially closed, and opened the last traditional public housing building in New York City. So of all the housing developments, the last one was one called Stanton Street on the Lower East Side. That was one of the projects that I worked on. So I kind of joke that Eleanor Roosevelt had first houses in the first one. I had Stanton Street in the last one. So I kind of like to have that little parenthesis.
It's a great bookend.
You have your mark
exactly.
in
It's a
the
nice
city.
bookend. So that was one of them. The other thing was this pipeline that I just talked about, the looking at where you might be able to develop additional housing on NYCHA campuses, where they're not just the floor area, but also the physical site that could accommodate it, whether it's an unused or underused parking lot or some type of space that could be used. And that's tougher than it sounds. Like, if you look at public housing from the street, it looks like, oh, look at all that space there is. If you look at it from above, a lot of times those sites are planned very specifically. The geometry of the view from above is very different than what it looks like from the street.
Yeah.
Right.
But the interesting thing about it is it's true that all that Tower in the Park stuff was done often with a trade of a design type that left some floor area on the table. So many of those campuses are designed in a certain way with height and that Tower in the Park look that we're all familiar with, didn't necessarily often use all the floor area, but also made it very hard to kind of tuck things in because people start using those spaces, whether it's for parking or for recreation. Or, right?
It's not like water, right? Wherever there's room, there's going to go.
Yes, exactly. It's a preferential pathway.
And you didn't have Google Maps back then. Are you just looking at existing maps?
Yeah, NYCHA has a pretty good record of the original, plans, and you can see where buildings are. It was actually required for a long time that it become this single-use look that you're familiar with. So you had to actually strip off these commercial overlays. You go to Baruch north side of Houston, that's all a commercial strip across there.
Yeah.
And then you look at the south side and you're like, oh, what happened there? And basically all of that became like this single zoning that accommodated only the housing, and it basically didn't want to mix uses, and you had this kind of pattern of open space and towers in the park and stuff. So it wasn't by accident that those things happened either. It was that was intentional planning that separated those uses and to some extent underbuilt it and created the look that we know now as public housing.
Interesting that you're using the term campuses. Is there a reason that term is used versus NYCHA sites or properties?
I was thinking the other day, because I was looking at some stuff on university planning and how they use that term campus, and it just comes from the Latin word for field. So a campus...
I love that you know that, by the way. That's fantastic.
So, and I know this because I was reading it recently. Thomas Jefferson, when he developed University of Virginia, there originally almost every university in America was a single building. So like it was Nassau Hall at Princeton, it was Old Queens at Rutgers, and Thomas Jefferson pivoted against that, and he said we shouldn't have these one big building that does everything. We should have campuses that actually develop a set of buildings around them. And I think that lent itself to, in later development, when you think about Tower in the Park stuff or Le Corbusier, people who did that kind of design, they went in that campus direction. They went in like super blocks. You see super block development. So I think public housing came out of that impulse. It came out of Tower in the Park, that Le Corbusier stuff that happened, and then you get the campus kind of planning version of that.
Good job, Tom.
So you eventually transitioned from NYCHA to, how many years were you at the Housing Authority?
So 4 years NYCHA, 12 years at HPD, and then about 8 years now at
HPD. Yeah, so HPD you've been at a while. How did that transition happen? Why did you decide to go there?
When I was at NYCHA, you could see the challenges. We had worked on Fulton houses. We had worked on a bunch of different sites, thinking about what could and should happen. But more than that, even then, alarm bells going off on the condition of housing. Yeah. Anyone who looked at it, you could tell that this was not a good trend and things were going to be difficult. I also, shout out to HPD and my colleagues, I don't think most New Yorkers understand how visionary and entrepreneurial the agency of HPD, the Housing Preservation and Development, it is a unique place that is filled with wave after wave of incoming folks who are practical, pragmatic, smart, sometimes very idealistic. When I worked with HPD from NYCHA, I had a very clear goal that HPD was a place that I wanted to get to and spend some time at, because you could see what they were doing and you could see the way they were making change. When you think about what the city charter empowers HPD to do, it's not, sometimes people think of it as just the affordable housing agency, but it's the city's housing agency. Urban renewal's in there, the planning element that happens there, the thoughtful policy around finance, tax incentives, which I know you all are like kind of, and at the end of the day, tax policy is virtually everything. It's so like you can do everything you want on budget and fiscal and whatever, but tax is really where you shape stuff and you flow stuff over time. And tax policy and that kind of planning is really what influences urban form, quite honestly, more than anything else. There's only so much money you can get on the public side to invest in something. But when you can direct the way flows happen over time, that's a really powerful thing. I was kind of part-time taking my experience at NYCHA and working on a newly formed NYCHA initiative to do some infill development housing in partnership with HPD from NYCHA. I think it is kind of outrageous that in a city as rich with resources and talent as New York, and you've got this public housing, public trust, land trust that exists, and without which New York City wouldn't work, wouldn't operate, right? The whole idea of it is a 400 to 600,000 people, depending on how you count it. Most of it's workforce housing. It's really been essential for New York to think about ways to preserve that and to make sure that people can stay in their homes and stay in their neighborhoods and not disinvest any further from that. When you do affordable housing, you realize it takes money to buy down high-cost areas to make them more affordable. In other words, you have to find ways to make investments to build things in high-cost areas to allow there to be affordability there, which is basically a buying down from the high-cost end. But similarly, you have to spend money to make investments in disinvested areas where there's not enough economic force at the moment to support construction. So on the one hand, you can build stuff, but you just can't build it affordably in certain areas. And in other places, you can't build it. It's highly affordable, but you either can't build it or there's not enough demand and interestingly, New York still has places that are both. There are obviously really high cost areas of New York. And then there are other areas where it still might be high cost or high rent because to build the stuff is expensive, but you can't incentivize the construction without certain programs. So you get that kind of happening in both directions. And so to your point, oftentimes things like mandatory inclusionary housing, voluntary inclusionary housing, some of the other tax incentives, 485X, the old 421A, are things that were designed to promote affordability in some of the higher cost areas. And then some of the direct programs and investments that really just made capital investments in areas where you needed the new investment and you couldn't support it with any kind of market force at the moment. And then to the question on bringing resources to public housing, I think the real thing that changed was HUD's understanding that after disinvesting in public housing for decades, I think 1998 was the Clinton era. It's called Quality Housing Work Responsibility Act. It's effectively the thing that systematically is dismantling public housing over time. When you look at that bill and what it does, you begin to understand that it was moving public housing away from the traditional approach of it, where you had a capital subsidy and an operating subsidy, and it was kind of underfunded, and the buildings weren't holding up, and they were in all this kind of difficult public management where the incentives weren't aligned to really maintain them properly. And it just was this gradual decay of public housing where basically public housing got shifted to kind of housing of last resort instead of a model that was more about workforce housing or mixed income or any of that. And so you had those kind of historical challenges. I think HUD recognized the need to shift from Section 9, which is that traditional public housing, to a Section 8 model, which is the rental assistance demonstration, where you basically get a Section 8 contract. It's been a good partner at scale because you can actually get these contracts, which are strong contracts that pay at fair market rents and a little bit above fair market rents to do different things. So basically, it was the first time you had an intervention at scale where you could begin to reposition properties. And the beauty of it is, and I always want to lead with this too, like kind of leading with principle, is that it remains in public ownership. NYCHA is leasing these properties, and all the tenant protections of the original leases that NYCHA residents have remain in place. And that's critical because there used to be there is still, but there was even more anxiety about the idea of moving from Section 9 to Section 8 if you were a tenant, because the idea that public housing was more secure or safer. And I think that in theory, from a regulatory perspective, could have been true, except for the fact that the buildings were disintegrating. Like it doesn't matter if you have a lease if the building doesn't exist, right?
Yeah.
Or
If you can't live in it, it's not
you
gonna.
can't live in it, right? Yeah.
And so this was a method to be able to refi and put some capital back in the building
Yeah.
to make those improvements.
So it's basically a long-term contract that's automatic renewable, has increases to it that respond to inflation and cost, and you can finance against. So we have been partners with NYCHA in financing against those contracts to do the rehabilitation and do the repositioning of those while NYCHA continues to ground lease them and operate them. So that has been a really profound shift. And if you go and look at some of those, it's night and day. If you go out and look at Williamsburg houses, which we just did the ribbon cutting on, it's not just, it's everything about it. If you go into the units, they're beautiful. If you look at the campus and the property, it's beautiful. The lighting and landscaping is beautiful. And really, when things become stigmatized, it's because when things have that look of disinvestment, that's it. Yeah. If you go out to a newly invested campus, it could be a Mitchell-Lama, or it could be public housing, or it could be any large apartment complex. If it's well kept and well maintained, it looks great, right? Yeah. You look at Stuytown looks great. Like a lot of people prefer it. It's got that park-like element. People like the community feel of it. There are a number of places that have that interior court element that can be a really remarkable experience for people in terms of being in the city.
You mentioned Mitchell-Lama. I grew up in a Mitchell-Lama project, Trump Village in Brooklyn. So I'm very cognizant of that and the maintenance. That has since gone private, and that's how my mom became a homeowner, right? She was able to buy a co-op for a very low price, and we were able to live and own shares in a co-op, and as opposed to renting somewhere down the street. And it was I'm a recipient of those benefits, so I'm sensitive to these types of topics. How does a building get chosen to convert and get those Section 8 projects? What's the threshold, right?
So there's a whole set of things, and there's a planning process at NYCHA that we're not as involved in on the HDC side and not even the HPD side, that they go through. It's not just like, some central planner goes out and says these. There's votes, like the tenant association will vote whether they want to stay in Section 9, whether they want to go to the RAD program or go to a newly formed program that is a trust program. And the housing trust program at NYCHA is similar to a version of PACT, but it has even more public operation to it. While they both remain in public ownership and NYCHA has ultimate control, the public has control of the sites, there is a contractual relationship on the PACT side where private operators will manage it under like a performance contract that you actually, if you don't do a good job, you can be removed and replaced. So it's sort of a performance-based experience.
But the low-income housing tax credits, which remains an issue, right? It's still being talked about to lower that threshold. How's that going? Where are the efforts in terms of lobbying and getting the government, federal government, to lower that threshold?
Yeah, so that's a great thing, and it's a good pivot from preservation to kind of new construction, although you can use credits to do preservation. We've been in New York using it to do a lot of new construction, and that's, traditionally you get these moments when the economy is really strong, interest rates are low, and you do a lot of new construction, and you increase supply, and you focus in that way. It's kind of make hay while the sun shines type of argument. And then you get these economic retrenchments or recessions or events like 2008, where you tend to pivot more towards the preservation of your housing stock. We've been through a disruption now with COVID. We have to figure out ways to do with a 1.4% vacancy rate in the city of New York, frictional vacancy, apartments that are available in a huge city. You have to figure out ways to introduce new supply and build new, and that's that 50,000 units a year. But at the same time, many of us are very concerned about what's happening on the preservation side. So let me just tackle your question. The federal government allocates a certain amount to every state based on population, and then the states allocate them out. So New York City gets a share of what New York State gets. We have been getting about $800 million a year. Sometimes it's $900 million a year. There's the 50% test says that you have to finance 50% of the project with bonds, and that uses that allocation. So basically, but if you lowered that requirement to 25%, you basically could stretch that allocation, essentially doubling it. But you've still got to find the other matching resources, and we know that when you increase the supply of something that is sold, like a tax credit, the pricing of that could change, right? And it's so valuable that you would then kind of say, well, we'll find more resources. It's almost like an offer that's too good to refuse.
Yeah.
Like at some point, you'd be saying no to free money if you couldn't figure out how to use it.
Because you could always go to the 50% if you needed to.
Right. Well, so exactly. So you would figure out how to use it, and we've said that we would figure out how to absorb it into our production pipeline. Yeah, and you could, by the way, you could use it. We've, for a whole set of reasons, used it on new construction, but you could also absorb some of it with less need for other sources in a preservation model. Right? I think it's important to note that, and the reason I say that is because that means that it is, even though it's an incredibly valuable tool, it's been one of the most useful tools. It's created more supply of affordable housing. I think there are a lot of practitioners who've begun to realize that it shouldn't be the only tool, and it shouldn't be. It doesn't get you everything. It doesn't get you, it's a nice core to start with. You never want to say, we don't want it, we don't need it, we'd rather have something else. But it is important to recognize what kinds of dislocations it created and what kinds of opportunities it foreclosed upon in terms of the way we build affordable housing and how communities participate in that. It kind of corporatized it a lot more, and it brought it into much more of a financing model that's important. But it's also important to kind of recognize the edges of it.
Given all these changes, the housing package with 485X, 467M, the city of Yes, including UAP, MIH, all of these things and more that are poised to really shape things and reshape things and make this city more New York, as you put it. How is HDC going to contribute? How do you view these things going forward, and what HDC's role is, and what the goals are going forward, given all these new tools that are available to hopefully make that moonshot goal of 50,000 a year?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think similar to you, I'm fundamentally optimistic about where this is headed. I think 485X it takes time to season. It takes time to gel. You don't want to overcorrect for things like high interest rates at a given moment. I do think that 485X is going to work, and I see a lot of interest in it. And it may not, on the geography, work everywhere as well all the time at first. So I think it's going to take some time to let that fill in. But I also think that we're at a moment where a lot of the work that the state did last year and the lifting of the FAR 12 cap, a lot of what City of Yes is doing, a lot of where 485X is going, a lot of where MIH went originally to kind of reset the floor on that, this idea that you're going to get affordability in a much broader section of everything that you do as a component of it, I think is a key move for New York. And I think it's a fundamental change that people don't fully appreciate. We used to have a situation in which you would kind of directly fund almost every affordable housing project, and sometimes you ended up over-concentrating poverty. They were all of like one tier of affordability, over deeply affordable. It often concentrated it by geography because, to your earlier point, it might have been easier or cheaper to put the affordability in a location. But now you've got a system that's emerging that allows you to include affordability in a range across a whole set of geography that is incredibly important and valuable and is a game changer. And letting that filter in over time, I think also gives the city an opportunity to reposition some of the stuff that may have over-concentrated poverty, quite honestly. The other thing was a lot of thoughtfulness about how you can add incentive without changing the shift share, meaning driving all the value to just landholders. You actually want to drive a lot of that value into affordability and housing production. And I think one of the beauties of UAP does this and MIH does it, particularly the fact that UAP works well with 485X, that basically you get the additional floor area and you get the 485X does double duty in terms of providing an incentive on that building, but because they work together, they don't drive land prices up front and then you're negotiating back off a higher land price. So I'm fundamentally optimistic that the economics and the policy approach on that is a good one. And by the way, you're already seeing it play out with MIH across the city and some of the VIH stuff that I know that you worked on for years and those types of things. It's successful, and I think it's going to give the city an opportunity to think flexibly about the way it does preservation work and the way it might want to mix incomes on a preservation side, because you're you're getting such a broader base of mixed income on the new construction side. And to your point, I think it's a good one that it really created affordable housing in high opportunity areas in the neighborhoods that previously you couldn't buy the affordability because it might have been $6 million an apartment. And when you think about what it costs to buy down a market rate apartment in New York City, so you're getting it a little more organically through that set of policy initiatives. So all that kind of stuff, I think you're going to see an increasing level of sophistication. And I say that because if you just look around the world, and New York isn't going to be able to avoid this, the number of buildings that are above 200 meters or 400 meters is increasing. And at some point, and you're already seeing in certain places that you're going to get some more height in certain places in New York, and figuring out how you properly incentivize that without overdriving the land price and then having to kind of negotiate it back, I think has been one of the key features of having all these things come in and saying, look, we're not going to throw everything in the kitchen sink at it right up front, particularly in a high interest rate environment, but we're going to let these things layer in. We're going to let them start to work with each other and gel. And then over time, as New York has always done in iterations, you're going to make adjustments. You're going to fine tune. One other thing I want to say, because I feel like people miss this on the politics side or whatever, it's always important for me to remind folks that people who don't like 421A or 485X, and I understand the complaint because it feels like those benefits go to projects that are producing some market rate housing, some people would characterize as luxury housing in some cases. But if you actually look at the capitalized cost of that benefit versus the cost of providing just the affordable component of those projects, the affordability that you get and the value of those units is greater than the cost of the entire incentive for the entire building. Yeah. So basically what you're saying is you're getting a good deal, and actually a really good deal, using 485X or 421A just to get the affordable. You would do that all day long just to buy the affordable. And then the other units that come along with it are just extra. So the public is really paying for only the affordable component at a significant discount, and the rest of it is just supply, which, by the way, adds another layer of affordability by adding supply that the public isn't paying for. You drive that vacancy rate so that you're not paying the tax of low vacancy, right? If you can't find an apartment, that raises the cost of housing for everyone. So someone asked the question, I think it's a good one, what's the cost of a 1.4% vacancy rate? So in 485X, you're getting a lot of affordability for just the cost of the benefit. And then beyond that, you're getting a lot of additional supply. So it's actually, I get the intuition to not like it or to find it easy to rail against or easy to argue against, but when you actually do the math, it's a very efficient program. It's a really efficient way to do affordable housing.
I don't think I thought about it that way also. Given the expense of creating affordable housing, the fact that they're getting this is actually a deal, right? It's paying for it. You would have to pay for it in one way or another. You're putting people, not just mixed income, but for UAP and MIH, right? You have a range of AMIs. It's not just a 60 and 80 the way it used to be. Now they're saying, no, we need 40, we need 60, we need 80, we need 100.
Yep.
We need that too, and we need market rate. So that understanding, yes, we need deeply affordable, but we need more, right? It's 1.4 vacancy. And I think the mixed income tries to solve it on the other side, not just building more, but also hopefully these people who are at different levels, they're integrated in these neighborhoods. They have more opportunities, whether it be the school, jobs. They have more resources. And then that hopefully eases the affordable housing crisis and attacking in both ways by both building and hopefully taking people out of those classes where they can't afford to live in a neighborhood by themselves without subsidies.
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is this idea that housing is more than just housing, right? It's a whole set of things that people are buying when they buy housing, which is schools, it's opportunity, it's transportation, it's sometimes access to fresh foods. It goes from really very, very basic things to very kind of complicated social networks of relations that happen out of housing. So it's when people make decisions around housing, it's a lot more than just what's it cost and how many square feet is it, right? It's a whole set of those things.
Yeah.
And as the urban form changes, the ability to integrate affordable housing into different building types and buildings that people don't often think of or may not have thought of traditionally as affordable housing. I think that's one of the great pivots that New York has done in the last couple of decades, is to start to have a lot more affordable housing distributed across all kinds of places that serve people and allow people to connect to those other kinds of opportunities, whether they're social networks, job markets, transit, whatever you might need, schools, daycare, whatever you might need, healthcare, those opportunities are really important, and they don't always get added up in the math of just can you build it or not.
Exactly, and it's thanks to people like you and the heads of all these agencies. Some of who people don't necessarily know their name; they don't stand out. There are lots of people at these agencies that work their butts off to make this stuff happen, come up with creative solutions, and we thank you. We thank you for your service, for doing all of these things that help New York become more New York, make sure that people are getting their just desserts, and
shape the New York City skyline.
Precisely.
That's another topic that I did want to talk a little bit about, because people are beginning to realize that this is a national problem. It used to be like local politics where people were afraid of the issue because you're going to get blamed locally over it. And everyone is like, but now I think people are beginning to realize that this is a national problem that needs a set of policies that are broader to deal with it. And a lot of it's around affordability. And figuring out how we do that. We raised this question of what is the cost of a 1.4% vacancy rate? You can just look at the price of something, but what does it preclude? Yeah. People look at what does it cost to convert a building from office to residential? And that's an important question. But the other side of that is the question of what does it cost to have parts of your city remain dark or disinvested in, right? You need to look at the full cost of that. And similarly, shelter and homelessness are that kind of a question too, because when you look at a place with the right to shelter, which is the right thing to do, what it costs to address that kind of spot demand on a day-to-day basis versus making the kinds of investments that we need to make to regain some control of the real estate to address the problem, I think is a question that fits into that similarly. And I think asking those types of questions, not just what does it cost in the transaction, but what does it cost on the externalities around it? What does it cost to not provide housing for people who need shelter and then have to fund it through spot demand, similar to the question of what does it cost to not convert an office to residential? To me, what's also alarming is the number of families that end up leaving New York because of that, kids leaving the school system, I think is something that is part of this affordable housing question that people really need to get.
And talent, people who work here, you want to attract the best people. If people can't find a place to live, they're going to go live somewhere else. You're always talking about the price of doing something, and you're not necessarily also putting in the price of not doing that something, which is part of that equation. And I think that's something that everybody really should be thinking about, because you leave that office space empty, right? Then the owner may not be able to pay their taxes. It gets foreclosed on. Who knows who takes over or who doesn't? It remains vacant. Then everything around it could start falling apart.
Yeah, and this has been like a theme that's flowed through this entire conversation, because it's true with transit, it's true with housing, it's true with density. Urban planning is often a gravity model, right? The more when you start to bring things together, the crowd draws a crowd, right? And you get these synergies, and you get this spin-off or these externality values. You can look at one thing and say, well, that costs something, but what does it spin off, and what's the value socially, or in terms of, even if you wanted to get into it to quantify it as like tax increment financing or something, even if you tax abate early some of the new housing you build, over time, the value that creates in terms of what it attracts and the other investments that happen are really significant and important. And there's a net value to all that stuff that I don't think we always look at properly.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to project that stuff, right?
It is.
I think that's why people generally were like, let's ignore that.
Or it's hard to project it in ways that everyone agrees upon, right? But you kind of know it when you see it. Like New York is fundamentally different than a lot of other places because of that, right? It has a dense system with high quality transit that attracts strong talent and labor market, and can produce housing, knows how to produce housing, knows how to produce neighborhoods, knows how to draw people from around the world and across the country. And the fact that New York is popular is a kind of a good problem to have, right? Yeah. But you want to also make sure that when people get here, you can accommodate them and people can have lives and careers where they choose to live.
Yeah. And thanks to you and other amazing leaders of these agencies, those dreams will come true. And we're lucky that we have people like you at the helm who have both the policy and the practical knowledge, the economic background, and the way that you're thinking and understanding these things and explaining it to people, whether it be in Congress or whether it be to people just or us. Tenants or us. We're so appreciative of you taking so much time to explain it. It's just, there's so much to unpack here. we absolutely love it. I think everybody that's listening is going to absolutely love it.
Well, thank you, guys. It's really great to meet with you all and have this conversation.
The perspective that you have is one that is so unique. We're so fortunate that we have this forum for you to be able to share that with everybody. And I think after today, I did become a little bit wiser. Not too much, but a little bit.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having us. It's
Thank
great
you so
to-
much.
Appreciate you coming in. Thank you. Well, everyone, that's our show. Thanks so much for listening.
And of course, don't forget to subscribe. Also, don't forget to leave comments. We would love to hear from you.
Yeah, feel free to reach out at info@sideandshine.com or visit our website at sideandshine.com. We really look forward to hearing from you.
You can also reach out to Brenda, Camille, and me at bslakowski@sideandshine.com, C. Almeida at sideandshine.com, and D. Shamshovich at sideandshine.com.
Those are lengthy last names. You can just find us on our website.
That's right.